What happens when a regime begins to collapse from the inside rather than under foreign pressure? That question began circulating among analysts the moment Iran's president publicly crossed a line that no senior figure inside the system had dared to approach for decades. If the highest civilian authority in the country openly questions the legitimacy of the Supreme Leader, can the system still claim control? What unfolded was not a routine political dispute, but a structural rupture. President Masoud Pezeshkian, speaking in blunt and unusually personal terms, drew a direct line between the ruling ideology and the daily misery of ordinary Iranians. By comparing his own deteriorating living standards as a highly trained heart surgeon to the affordability of basic goods before the revolution, he did something unprecedented. He reframed the crisis not as foreign sabotage or moral decay, but as a failure of governance rooted at the very top. In doing so, he implicitly stripped the Supreme Leader's authority of its long-cultivated aura of infallibility. Within hours, the consequences moved from rhetoric to reality. Security sources and verified footage indicated sudden unrest in Tehran, followed by the torching of symbolic regime-linked properties. Analysts noted that these events did not resemble earlier protest waves sparked by fuel prices or morality policing. This time, the spark came from inside the state itself. The president's remarks functioned less as a protest speech and more as a signal flare to the population and to elites watching closely behind closed doors. What makes this moment strategically different is timing. Iran was already under immense internal pressure from inflation, currency collapse, and regional isolation. At the same time, Western intelligence assessments in late December indicated heightened anxiety within Tehran over escalating Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure attacks that were steadily degrading Moscow's export revenues and forcing Iran to reconsider its own vulnerability to similar asymmetric pressure. Analysts at Defense News and the Financial Times have repeatedly pointed out that authoritarian systems under economic strain are most fragile when elite cohesion begins to fracture. That fracture now appears visible. Pezeshkian did not call for revolution, nor did he endorse street violence. Instead, he targeted the ideological foundation of clerical rule by portraying continued loyalty to the system as detached from material reality. This subtlety matters. Revolutions that succeed rarely begin with tanks in the streets. They begin when narratives collapse. The president's words undermine the regime's most powerful claim that suffering is a necessary sacrifice for moral and national survival. Western observers were quick to contextualize the moment. Former US and European diplomats speaking to Reuters described the speech as a legitimacy shock, noting that no amount of external sanctions could replicate the damage caused by an internal defection at the top. NATO policy analysts privately compared the situation to late-stage Soviet elite fragmentation, when reformist figures unintentionally accelerated systemic collapse by speaking too plainly. Meanwhile, the White House was watching closely. With Donald Trump once again in office, Washington's posture toward Iran had shifted from strategic ambiguity to personal deterrence. Trump's earlier statements made clear that large-scale violence against civilians would trigger direct consequences. This external pressure magnified the internal split. The Supreme Leader could no longer respond freely without risking international escalation, while the president's stance emboldened millions who sensed hesitation at the top. Yet the most dangerous implication lay beneath the surface. Once a sitting president demonstrates that defiance is possible, others begin to calculate their own survival. Military officers, provincial governors, and economic technocrats suddenly face a choice: remain loyal to a shrinking center of power or adapt to a rapidly changing reality. And as the streets of Tehran filled and regime messaging grew increasingly defensive, one question began to dominate intelligence briefings across Europe and North America: if this breach holds, where will the pressure erupt next? What followed next shocked analysts even more, as the unrest moved far beyond the capital and into a region the regime had long counted on as secure. How does private economic despair turn into a nationwide political eruption? That question became unavoidable as President Pezeshkian's remarks began circulating far beyond Tehran's political circles and into factories, universities, and provincial markets. If the president himself could no longer reconcile professional achievement with basic affordability, many Iranians asked a sharper question: what future remained for everyone else? The speech acted as a catalyst because it translated abstract grievances into lived reality. Inflation figures long dismissed by the state as exaggerated or foreign manipulated suddenly gained credibility when voiced by a man at the top of the system. According to recent economic data cited by international financial analysts, Iran's real purchasing power has declined by more than 50% over the past 5 years, while food and fuel prices have surged far faster than wages. Pezeshkian's comparison between past and present incomes cut through years of ideological messaging and reframed the crisis as systemic, not temporary. Within days, protests expanded in both scale and coordination. Unlike earlier unrest driven by specific triggers, this wave spread horizontally, crossing social classes and age groups. Labor hubs, medical associations, and university networks quietly amplified the president's remarks, while social media channels, despite internet restrictions, circulated videos and testimonies at a pace security services struggled to contain. Analysts described the dynamic as economic recognition, the moment when disparate frustrations align around a shared narrative of betrayal. This internal momentum coincided with a worsening external environment. Western intelligence reports and open-source satellite analysis confirmed intensified Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure during the same period, targeting refineries, storage depots, and pipeline nodes deep inside Russian territory. Coverage by Reuters and the BBC highlighted how these attacks were not only disrupting Russia's export revenues, but also exposing the vulnerability of centralized energy systems under sustained drone pressure. For Tehran, a major energy exporter under sanctions, the lesson was unmistakable. Military analysts noted that the Ukrainian model precision persistence and plausible deniability posed a troubling precedent for Iran. The leadership understood that domestic instability combined with external energy disruption could quickly overwhelm state capacity. This realization heightened public anxiety and fed the perception that the regime was losing control on multiple fronts simultaneously. On the streets, the atmosphere shifted from protest to confrontation. Footage verified by independent monitors showed security forces retreating from certain districts rather than dispersing crowds. This behavior marked a psychological turning point. Once the image of omnipotent control, cracked numbers became decisive. Protesters no longer dispersed at nightfall, and strikes began to ripple through transport and municipal services, quietly compounding the state's logistical strain. Western observers emphasized that this was not merely an Iranian phenomenon. NATO strategic assessments have long warned that economic warfare, especially when amplified by energy disruptions, can accelerate internal fractures in authoritarian systems. With Russia absorbing the impact of Ukrainian strikes and China facing its own economic headwinds, Iran's unrest appeared increasingly connected to a broader pattern of systemic stress across the authoritarian axis. Meanwhile, Washington's messaging sharpened. President Donald Trump reiterated that the United States was monitoring civilian casualties, closely signaling that repression would carry costs beyond rhetoric. This stance constrained Tehran's options force, risked escalation restraint, risked momentum loss. The result was hesitation visible both on the streets and within elite circles. Yet the most consequential development was still unfolding quietly. As protests spread geographically, attention turned toward regions previously considered politically insulated from unrest. Analysts began to ask whether economic anger alone could bridge long-standing ethnic and regional divides. Meanwhile, a sudden surge of demonstrations in a strategic northern city suggested the answer might be far more destabilizing than the regime had anticipated. Why did the unrest suddenly ignite in a region long treated as politically manageable? That question dominated security briefings when mass demonstrations erupted in Tabriz, a city the regime had historically viewed as controllable through a mix of economic incentives, cultural accommodation, and strategic neglect. For years, Tehran relied on ethnic balancing to prevent unified opposition. What happened next dismantled that assumption in a matter of hours. Tabriz is not just another provincial capital. It is Iran's industrial spine in the northwest, a logistics hub linking trade routes to the Caucasus and Turkey, and the cultural center of the country's Azeri population. Past protest movements stalled when they failed to mobilize this region. This time, the trigger was personal and symbolic. President Pezeshkian's Azeri background resonated deeply, transforming his defiance into a signal that ethnic identity and national grievance were no longer separate channels of dissent. Crowds in Tabriz adopted slogans that surprised even veteran Iran watchers. Instead of regional or ethnic demands, chants emphasized unity across Persian and Azeri lines, directly targeting clerical authority. Analysts noted that this rhetorical shift shattered one of the regime's core security doctrines, divide to survive. Once ethnic solidarity flipped from a stabilizing tool into a mobilizing force, the regime lost its buffer in the northwest. The strategic implications were immediate. Tabriz sits astride supply corridors feeding multiple military districts. Disruption there does not merely generate headlines. It complicates troop movements, fuel distribution, and internal communications. Defense analysts compared the development to removing a keystone from an arch. The structure may remain standing briefly, but the stress redistributes unpredictably. This internal vulnerability unfolded as Iran's external partners were facing parallel pressures. Ukraine's continued strikes on Russian refineries and export nodes, widely reported by Western outlets, underscored how industrial choke points can accelerate strategic paralysis. Military experts observed that Tehran was now confronting a similar scenario from within industrial unrest, amplifying political instability not through sabotage, but through mass non-cooperation. Security force behavior in Tabriz reflected this anxiety. Verified footage showed units deploying defensively rather than assertively protecting administrative buildings instead of dispersing crowds. Such posture suggested concern about overextension and loyalty, especially among conscripts drawn from the same communities now protesting. Western intelligence analysts emphasized that regimes rarely collapse when their forces are defeated militarily. They collapse when those forces hesitate. Meanwhile, NATO assessments began to factor Iran's internal fragmentation into broader regional planning. A destabilized Iran affects energy markets, maritime security, and the balance of power stretching from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. With Russia already strained by sustained Ukrainian pressure on its energy sector, and China cautious about overcommitting to unstable partners, Tehran's margin for error narrowed further. Yet the most unsettling aspect for the leadership was psychological. Tabriz had remained quiet through earlier waves of unrest. Its awakening signaled that fear was no longer evenly distributed. Once a region known for discipline and industrial order breaks ranks, others reassess their own thresholds for action. As night fell, reports indicated that protests were spreading outward from Tabriz to secondary cities along key transport routes. The regime faced a new dilemma: suppress a united front and risk fracturing its security apparatus, or hesitate and allow momentum to consolidate. Yet what followed next shocked analysts even more, as evidence emerged that the state's own enforcement mechanisms were beginning to lose control of the streets altogether. What happens when a state's security forces no longer believe they can dominate the streets? That question moved from theory to observation, as footage and field reports revealed a pattern that Iran's leadership had spent decades insisting was impossible. Organized forces retreating, fragmenting, and improvising under civilian pressure. In Tehran and several major cities, the operational posture of the security apparatus changed visibly. Instead of coordinated dispersal tactics, Basij units were seen forming defensive perimeters, using police vehicles as barricades rather than tools of control. Analysts familiar with crowd control doctrine noted that such behavior signals more than exhaustion. It reflects uncertainty about escalation thresholds and fear of losing cohesion. Once units begin prioritizing self-protection, command authority erodes rapidly. Independent verification from leaked videos showed fires engulfing government-linked buildings, customs facilities, and municipal offices. Internet restrictions slowed the flow of information, but did not stop it. Satellite connectivity and peer-to-peer sharing ensured that images of burning symbols traveled faster than official denials. Western intelligence assessments emphasized that visual dominance matters as much as physical control. When protesters believe the state is retreating, numbers multiply. This moment unfolded against a wider backdrop of asymmetric conflict shaping modern warfare. Military analysts drawing parallels with Ukraine's campaign against Russian energy infrastructure highlighted a shared lesson: centralized systems break under sustained, decentralized pressure. In Ukraine's case, drones targeting refineries and depots forced Moscow to divert air defenses inward. In Iran's case, mass protests forced security resources to scatter, diluting effectiveness everywhere. The regime attempted to reassert deterrence through force, but reports suggested uneven execution. In some districts, security forces fired sporadically, then withdrew. In others, they avoided engagement altogether. Such inconsistency deepened public confidence that the system was losing its nerve. NATO-affiliated analysts observed that authoritarian regimes rely on predictability to maintain fear. Unpredictability reverses that equation. Hospitals became another indicator of systemic strain. Medical sources cited by international journalists reported surges of wounded civilians overwhelming facilities and exposing the human cost of containment efforts. These reports place Tehran in a bind: conceal casualties and lose credibility, or acknowledge them and validate the protest narrative. Either option weakened authority. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump's posture loomed over every decision. Having previously demonstrated a willingness to target senior figures directly, Trump's warnings constrained Tehran's calculus. Any visible escalation risked triggering external consequences at a moment when internal loyalty was already in question. Western analysts described this as a double-bind: repression invited intervention, restraint invited collapse. Inside the regime, signs of panic surfaced. According to intelligence reporting, alert levels were raised across multiple branches, including elite units traditionally reserved for external threats. Yet their deployment focused inward, reflecting fear not of invasion, but of defection. The leadership's greatest concern was no longer protesters alone, but the possibility that regular army units might hesitate or refuse orders. Strategically, this shift reverberated beyond Iran. NATO planners began reassessing regional stability scenarios, factoring in disruptions to energy flows, maritime security, and proxy networks. With Russia under pressure from Ukrainian strikes and China wary of entanglement, Iran's capacity to project power outward diminished as it struggled to hold ground at home. Yet the most revealing detail came from the streets themselves. Protesters did not disperse after clashes. They regrouped. That persistence signaled a psychological turning point. Fear, once the regime's most reliable asset, was no longer evenly distributed. Meanwhile, as Tehran's grip weakened internally, attention turned sharply outward to Washington, where signals suggested that external pressure was moving from words to preparation. What changes when external pressure shifts from rhetoric to visible readiness? That question gained urgency as Washington's response moved beyond statements and into measurable signals that intelligence services across Europe and the Middle East could not ignore. While Iran's leadership struggled to contain unrest at home, the shadow of American power under President Donald Trump began to reshape the regime's strategic calculations. Trump's messaging was deliberately personal and unambiguous. Rather than addressing Iran in abstract diplomatic terms, he framed the crisis around accountability at the very top. Western analysts noted that this approach differed sharply from past administrations. Deterrence was no longer about punishing the state, but about threatening consequences for individual decision-makers. Having previously ordered the elimination of high-profile targets, Trump's credibility did not rest on speculation. At the operational level, movements reinforced the message. Open-source flight tracking and defense reporting confirmed heightened activity involving U.S. strategic airlift and refueling assets across Europe and the Middle East. Defense news analysts emphasized that such patterns are rarely symbolic. They signal contingency planning options being placed on the table rather than merely discussed. For Tehran, already stretched by internal deployments, the implication was stark escalation would be met by readiness, not hesitation. This external pressure intersected with a deteriorating regional environment. Ukraine's continued strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, widely covered by Reuters and the BBC, had demonstrated how sustained disruption could weaken even a nuclear-armed state's economic resilience. Military experts argued that Washington had internalized this lesson. Precision persistence and economic targeting were now central to Western strategy, blurring the line between military and financial warfare. NATO assessments began factoring Iran's vulnerability into broader contingency planning. A destabilized Iran affects maritime routes, energy markets, and alliance security from the eastern Mediterranean to the Gulf. With Russia already forced to defend its own industrial base against Ukrainian drones, the Western strategic community saw an opportunity to apply layered pressure across the authoritarian spectrum without direct large-scale conflict. Inside Tehran, this translated into paralysis. Intelligence reports suggested that senior commanders were increasingly focused on personal security rather than operational coherence. Resources were diverted to protect leadership compounds, while ordinary units faced shortages and unclear orders. Such behavior reinforced public perception that the regime's priorities had shifted from governance to survival. China and Russia watched uneasily. For Moscow, already grappling with energy revenue losses, Iran's instability threatened a key partner. For Beijing, the prospect of regime collapse in a major energy supplier complicated long-term economic planning. Analysts described the moment as a stress test for the authoritarian axis. Could mutual support compensate for simultaneous internal crises? Trump's stance further narrowed Tehran's options. Any large-scale crackdown risked provoking U.S. action. Restraint risked accelerating internal collapse. This strategic squeeze mirrored patterns seen elsewhere where regimes under both internal and external pressure tend to fracture rather than consolidate. As the crisis deepened, diplomats quietly acknowledged that the center of gravity had shifted. The decisive factor was no longer Iran's military hardware or ideological messaging, but time. Every day of unrest eroded confidence, loyalty, and coordination. Yet what followed next shocked analysts even more, as the implications of Iran's crisis began to ripple outward raising questions about whether other authoritarian systems could face the same internal contagion. Can a single internal rupture destabilize an entire authoritarian ecosystem? That question moved to the center of global strategic debate as events in Iran began to resonate far beyond its borders. What unfolded was no longer viewed solely as a national crisis, but as a case study in how modern authoritarian systems may fail not through invasion or sanctions alone, but through internal defection at the highest levels. The most unsettling aspect for other authoritarian capitals was the mechanism of Iran's breakdown. This was not a popular uprising led by exiles or foreign-backed opposition figures. It was triggered by a sitting president, a product of the system itself, who publicly stripped the ruling ideology of its moral and economic credibility. Western political scientists described this as an autoimmune shock, where the regime's own institutions turn against its core. In Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang, this pattern raised immediate alarms. Russian analysts already grappling with the consequences of Ukrainian strikes on energy infrastructure recognized a dangerous parallel. Ukraine's campaign had shown how sustained pressure on critical systems could drain state capacity. Iran now demonstrated how elite disillusionment could accelerate that drain internally. Together, these dynamics formed a blueprint that no amount of air defense or censorship could fully counter. North Korea emerged as a particularly sensitive case. Its leadership structure relies heavily on the myth of absolute loyalty and semi-divine authority. Western intelligence experts noted that Iran's example punctured the assumption that inner circle cohesion is guaranteed. If a senior figure in Tehran could openly challenge the supreme leader and survive long enough to mobilize society, the psychological barrier protecting similar regimes elsewhere weakened. China's response was more cautious, but equally telling. State media coverage was muted, while internal think tanks reportedly circulated restricted analyses emphasizing ideological discipline and elite unity. For Beijing, the lesson was not about protests, but about narrative control. Once economic hardship becomes a shared language between leaders and citizens, containment becomes exponentially harder. From a NATO perspective, the implications were strategic rather than ideological. Alliance planners assessed that authoritarian instability can generate cascading effects, disrupted energy markets, refugee flows, proxy force degradation, and unpredictable military behavior. Iran's crisis, layered atop Russia's economic attrition from Ukrainian strikes, suggested that Western pressure was converging across multiple theaters, not by design alone, but by circumstance. Yet uncertainty remained. Authoritarian systems are resilient precisely because they adapt. Iran's leadership still possessed coercive tools and outcomes were not predetermined. Western analysts cautioned against assuming inevitability. Revolutions can stall fracture or be co-opted. What mattered was not prediction, but recognition that the old assumptions of permanence no longer held. As Tehran's streets continued to fill and elite loyalties remained in question, one reality became clear: power derived solely from fear decays rapidly once fear becomes mutual. The Iranian case showed that the most dangerous threat to centralized authority may sit at the same table, speak the same language, and wear the same uniform. And as global observers weighed the consequences, a final question lingered: was Iran an exception, or the first visible crack in a much larger structure?